It's Wednesday the 21st of July, and this is Mary Ingleby, and I'm interviewing Professor Thomas Preston at his home in Christchurch. Can we just begin by talking about the reason why you didn't go into the colonial service initially?
Well, I went up to Cambridge after my war service, and I took a degree in agriculture, which was to prepare people to be district officers or district agricultural officers. But I had an uncle who was in Africa growing tobacco in Malawi. He was Minister of Agriculture by that time there. And I thought I would go and join him. But before I did that, he suggested I should join the colonial service. I went to Henley to row, and I hitched a lift up for my interview to be a district officer. And the man driving the car I hitched in turned out to be MacLeod Smith, who was in the colonial service, who was to interview me. And he said, "Don't go in it." And he said to me, A, I can't interview you, and B, I know enough about you to say, go into industry and come back to help in the colonies after they have become independent. He said, that is going to be the career of the future. And I met him when I went to Sierra Leone in 1960, and that was in 1951 that we had this chance meeting. However, I then worked for the major tobacco company, Gallagher's, at my uncle's suggestion, and I decided I really didn't want my life's work to wind up in an ashtray, and so I moved into a family business which was connected with milling, and I saw an advertisement to go to Kenya to be agricultural advisor to the Farmers Cooperative, Unga Limited, and I became their agricultural advisor for 4 years.
When was this then?
1952 for 4 years.
And you didn't tell on tape about your qualifications for this post to be agriculture advisor.
Well, I had a degree in agriculture. The man who was in the job had been to Cambridge, but his wife was frightened by the Mau Mau, and he had put in an advertisement for somebody with a Cambridge degree in nutrition who knew about animal feeds industry and who was prepared to take the risk. I was a bachelor, so I went. The requirement of the job was to formulate rations for the burgeoning animal industry, pigs, poultry, dairy, on largely the farmers of the White Highlands, but there was a good deal of native agriculture also. And Unga Limited recycled famine relief stocks, and very often there would be a surplus, and this would be bought by the East African High Commission, and after a few years it would go mouldy or begin to be unfit for human consumption, and there would be some more. So what do we do with this stuff? We have to feed it to animals. So I was in charge of the storing and use of these things, along with the storing and use of things like coffee husks and pyrethrum muck, which is the waste of the pyrethrum industry, as well as the wastes from rice milling, maize milling, flour milling, which is the bran and pollard. So we made animal feeds there. The company had been founded by the father of Beryl Markham, whose famous book, West into the Night, The Aviator. She had been brought up by Lord Delamere after her mother had left, and the Delameres were a major client of Unga Limited. We used to send a couple of railway truckloads of soy sambu cubes up to their famous farm in the bottom of the Rift Valley. We had other clients of this sort. They were scions of the British aristocracy, and they were sometimes a bit touchy about food being wrong or not suitable for their animals and horses.
Were they legends in their own lifetime?
Oh yes, this is the set who are known as the Happy Valley set. Of course, a lot of them others were very serious farmers, and They were all involved at this time in the dangers of Mau Mau. You would visit a farm and it was surrounded by barbed wire, and people carried guns the whole time, and they were hearing of atrocities at the same time as trying to run a business. I arrived by air, and it took 3 days to get to Nairobi by air in those days. And I was met, and I was told there had been a terrible problem. The famine relief stock of haricot beans had been deemed by a tribe which hadn't got any maize or anything to eat as being unsuitable, and they had demanded to be given the very unnutritious cassava. And we had had to exchange the rather starchy cassava for the haricot beans, and I authorised a change in formulation which allowed this in pig feeds. And with that, several hundred pigs turned up their toes and died throughout the colony. At this time, Jomo Kenyatta was being tried up in Kitale for sedition, I think. It was a very interesting thing, because I met at a luncheon when I was dealing with poisoning of pigs. The trial was on, and I was sat down at the table with Denzel Britt and Fenner Brockway, his lawyers, and my father-in-law-to-be was a member of Parliament of a very bright blue colour. And we had an amusing conversation in a civilised way about what was going on. What I didn't realise, and I'm now ashamed to admit, is that that trial, which I went and looked at, and it was dominated by Jomo Kenyatta, it was in fact a rather foregone conclusion what was going to happen. However, that's by the by. The business of the pigs, they were dropping dead, and we were feeding these rations. A friend of mine who was the chief vet, we'd been at Cambridge together, and my story is really one of, who do you know as much by chance? I'd been sitting in the New Stanley Hotel on my first weekend there, and who had walked in but Robert Ayresmith to say he was Senior Livestock Improvement Officer, and his wife was gorgeous song and dance girl by the name of Carol Ray, one of the few people that Russell Flint painted and gave her her own picture as a Russell Flint portrait, and she was an Australian television presenter for the rest of her life. I think he moved to Australia, but Robert was there as a chief vet, and we took this meal with the haricot beans in it and the cassava and couldn't understand what was happening. And he was feeding it to pigs on the research farm, and he was getting most fantastic live weight gain. We couldn't kill one. I would be called by air to a farm where there'd be 10 pigs with their toes in the air with bright red spots on the bottom. And we in the end we did discover, but this is what it was, and some of the product had got wet in transport, and a cyanogenic glucoside was giving cyanide. But this was not before the government analyst found arsenic in some of our products. It was a mistaken analysis, so it transpires.
Well, they thought they'd found arsenic.
They definitely did, and there was a panic. The Mau Mau are putting arsenic in pig food. The next thing it will be in the flour. And so there was this very high profile bit of detective work which I did on arrival in Kenya. And thereafter things settled down quite a bit, and it was much easier.
Did you know about the Mau Mau before you went out?
Oh yes.
So you were prepared?
Yes.
And was it as you thought? Was it worse or better than you thought?
Well, I've just been reading some of my own letters. My mother was a very diligent keeper of letters, and my own first impressions were singularly naive now I come to look at them. I can remember going through the stage of not being able to recognise one African from another, and getting to the stage where I could recognise whether a man was a Jaluo or a Kikuyu or a Maasai, and then getting on to be able to speak Swahili. And it's a gradual process, but the danger, I suppose, brainwashed to go out there. People said that they are not a danger, and I had been in the services in the war, and I thought, well, this is just a bit of a risk that one would take. I used to visit farmers because I'd held a commission in Britain, I had to resign it. And I was exempt, because I was an agricultural advisor, for a couple of years from being called up in Kenya to be part of the police force. So I was very lucky in that way. But I carried a revolver, and being a bachelor, I used to get invited out to people's houses and farms at night. There was a curfew for most people, but I tended to ignore it. And I had, for example, a friend, Mr. Stretfield, at the bottom of the Rift Valley. As you go from Nairobi to Naivasha, he had a great splash of scarlet salvia seed he was growing for Suttons or somebody like that. Now, he turned out to have been working in the Burma Oil Company with my father-in-law, and he had been invalided out in Lady Roper, that's my mother-in-law's place, when Burma was evacuated in the war. And he more or less said, well, I owe my life to the fact that I was put on the last ship getting out of Rangoon in her place.
We were talking about Mau Mau. One thing I'd like to ask you was, you obviously, you may have been naive, young, whatever, but you weren't that frightened about it. Do you think people generally were? Was it a frightening time?
No, I would say in retrospect that there were some people who were quite panicked and left, like my predecessor's wife, Leslie Coburn. On the other hand, people put on a very great show of not being frightened. You would go to dinner with somebody and you would put your revolver on the place above your pudding spoon on the table, and people with guns would back a wall, and this was traditional. I stayed in a hotel, the Loresho Hotel, which was the Delamere's townhouse at one stage out in the coffee estates, and there I was asked to be the alternate days guard for an old gentleman called Brigadier General Sir Godfrey Rhodes, who built the railway, I believe, that Lawrence of Arabia blew up, and he was general manager of East African Railways and Harbours. And he said, well, I live in the Kikuyu Reserve, I'm too old to carry a gun. He's a brigadier, so he knew how to use one. And Molly, his wife, rather liked the Kikuyu, and she was fond of her servants. And so they said to a man called Colonel Bayliss and I, will you come and live with us as paying guests, and part of your duties are that he was very cunning. He said, well, Tom, you will have the odd days of the month and I'll have the even days of the month, and there are more for me than for him. And we used to dine with them alternate nights, and in our social life it was a very good way of working. Well, I'd left my revolver one day there, and the houseboy said he'd found Bwana Tom's revolver in the bathroom. I'd forgotten to put it on. And the penalty was £100 fine and 6 months in jail for losing it. And I got a panic call from Molly, so she'd locked herself in the bathroom with my revolver, and I'd got to knock 3 times when I got to the house, and I could have it back. And so I shot back and collected it. And long after Mau was over, they discovered that the local secretary and oath administrator were in fact their 2 servants. So whether we were wrong, and they said they would never have attacked them. So does that answer the question very slightly?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And actually quite a lot of the Africans were frightened as well, weren't they?
Oh, very much more. They were
more than you. Yes.
Very much more vulnerable. I can remember on one occasion where I was up in the Kikuyu Reserve on a very muddy, slippery road, and I went into a village, and as I was getting into the village, a tree was felled in front of me, and it just went down in the road, no way out. I slammed the thing into reverse, it was a Peugeot, and I skidded out, and I was to have been sandwiched between 2 trees, so I was very glad I was locked in the car, and I was very glad I thought quickly. That was one of the few occasions. Other than the time coming back from Stretfield, somebody rolled some large rocks down the hill towards me. They went off the road. The Gloucesters had been ambushed there a little bit later.
Fine. I just want to ask you, before we leave this bit of your career, when we were talking about the Happy Valley people at the beginning of the tape, I asked you if they were legendary. I mean, did people gossip about them? Or was it sort of accepted who they were?
Well, Nairobi society was, I think, polarised into two camps. There was the Muthaiga Club, which was the sort of people who would be listed in Burke's Peerage and Debrett and the landed gentry, and they farmed and they wined and dined. And then there were more serious people who had to earn a salary, who were in government. And I was a member of the Nairobi Club, as was, for example, the general manager of the Railways and Harbours, Fred Dalton, who was a very good friend of mine. And he had weekly conferences on how to end the Mau Mau. The story of the ending of Mau Mau is quite interesting. I told you a moment ago that I saw him put down. He was in shorts, a dominating figure in the dock. And I had another friend who used to go to visit him regularly. He was a sort of political agent, secret in many ways, but he used to see him every week, and I knew this was going on. And I knew what was happening within the circle of intelligent, well-informed leaders. Michael Blundell had spoken, he was a member of Legislative Council. He had spoken from the bar of the House of Commons on this subject, and my father-in-law had been fairly instrumental in helping him to do that. Michael Blundell defected in the sense that he gave up, and his place was taken by a fascinating character, Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Mackenzie, DSO and Bar, DFC and Bar, South African veterinary student, who became Jomo Kenyatta's Minister of Agriculture. But he was, when I knew him, a dairy farmer working for on Dalgetty's money, and Dalgetty's were in a way the opposition of Unga, my employer, but Bruce Mackenzie, a superb man. Chapman Pincher told me that he ran the best MI5 secret agents networks in Africa. And I knew a lot of other people there, as you may have heard, in the same game. And there were little cells of people who didn't know what the others were doing, but suspected and kept their noses out of their affairs. Bruce was the leader of the farmers. I told you a moment ago about Fred Dalton, the general manager of the Railways and Harbours. He didn't get a if I'm fine. Am I sorry? There's been a link. Am I jerking about? Fred Dalton was an Irishman, and I was very lucky in that I'm partly Irish and Cambridge, and there's a little network of people who were at Cambridge together, and there's a little network of people who were at Trinity together, and he was the latter. My grandfather had been a professor there, and the family were in Dublin. And Fred crossed Sir Philip Mitchell, the governor, who tried to tell him what tariffs he was going to have to pay on goods going out around East Africa. He said, keep your nose out of my business. I'm the one I'm not going to lose money. Just because you say so, I shall choose the rates. And so he didn't get his knighthood. That was the punishment that Fred had from the government. It's very interesting the way government works. Fred's had a weekly meeting with his neighbour, Derek Erskine, Sir Derek Quince Erskine, as he now is, and he was recommended for his knighthood by Jomo Kenyatta. And when Jomo Kenyatta's sentence came up and he was about to be released, he was sent a piece of paper with a man driving a Rolls Royce. Said, "Dear Mr. Kenyatta, I am the leader of the commercial interests." He was chairman of the Board of Commerce in Nairobi. "We must work together. I enclose two pieces of paper which I have signed. They're blank cheques, and I would remind you that no cheque in Kenya is legal if it is signed for more than 1 million shillings. I'm also giving you my second car. Derek was an industrialist making biscuits and selling groceries, and it is at your disposal. My house is at your disposal. You may use the guest rooms on arrival. I wish you well.
So he was making sure.
Jomo Kenyatta was given more or less carte blanche by the European group when he came out. Their view was that if it went back to a bloodbath, nobody would benefit. And so Jomo was given the funding he needed to get a reasonable handover.
Did people do that purely for commercial reasons, or did they support, what did they think?
Oh, I'm quite certain. I'm quite certain that there was a sense of fair play, a sense of decency, a sense of justice, the inevitability of what was going to happen. I might go back to my Uncle Frank Warren in Nyasaland. His estate was called Kakuyu, and funnily enough, the Kikuyu were the people. His estate was just outside Lilongwe, which is now the capital, but it wasn't originally. And he went there originally before the First War. He rose to be a major in the gunners and an MC in the First War. He got another one in the Second War in the KAR. He started tobacco planting there, and I can remember distinctly him telling me as an undergraduate in the Mirabelle nightclub in Mayfair, he said, "Tom, when I went to Africa first, I thought I was starting another 1,000 years of a feudal dynasty where we, the intelligent, clever Anglo-Norman aristocrats, would rule." He said, "I decided in the Second World War that this wasn't to happen, and I decided that we had got to have independence for each colony, each tribe, and that colonies were not on clear-cut tribal ethnic divisions." He said his part was, and he'd already done this by the time I was an undergraduate, he'd come back from the war. My aunt had been tragically killed in an air accident in 1947, the Spencer Airways crash, and this had tempered his thinking, but he had decided to divide up his very substantial interests in land, for example, Bunda Mountain in Lilongwe, which was a family estate. That was given to the university, and he divided his farm up so that he could, and his managers could do the tractor work. If you were a sergeant, you got 3 times as much as somebody who'd been a corporal, who got twice as much as somebody who'd been a private in the KAR, and he gave them blocks of land either side of a road, and then there was a field for tobacco, there was a field for maize, there was a field for grass, and then opposite there was something else, and the whole of the field for tobacco would be ploughed by removing the fences or across these quite small little shambas or fields by his tractors. Then he would buy the tobacco after it had been plucked and put it through his flue barns to make the smoked tobacco. Now his idea was on this estate to have small farmers, self-employed and self-regulated, and it was the first of these experiments.
Preparing for independence then?
Oh yes. In fact, in Nairobi, I can remember meeting Robert Ruark. I don't know if you know Robert Ruark's book Uhuru. He was an American who wrote a very good bestseller. Uhuru means freedom. And Robert Ruark would give anybody as much whiskey as they wanted if they would tell him anecdotes that he was going to use in his book. And he in fact transposed the story of the Warren Kakuyu estate, which I told him in one of Tubby Block's hotels in return for some libations. And he put it actually in one of his characters up in Molo, which was in the highlands of north side of the Rift Valley.
So it's not exactly accurate, at least it was a sort of true account of his book.
Robert Ruark's, I don't know whether what is truth. So,
well, yes, it's
exactly why, what is happening and where. You see, the Mau Mau didn't affect things. I was telling you earlier on that the business of being in animal feeds is to use what might go in the industrial dustbin. Up in the northern part of Kenya, and one of the things that Unga made was cubes for the police's camel corps. There was a cousin of Gerald Templar. My wife was partly Templar, his cousin in the family. He was a provincial commissioner up there, and he wanted racing camels to race against the Ethiopians. And he had camels patrolling the boundary, but between him and civilization there was a vast area of semi-desert with a couple of large lakes in it, Baringo and Turkana. And Baringo had a man called Roberts had shot out the crocodiles in order to have tilapia, in order to have a fish industry, and the livestock people were saying, well, these people are swapping cattle for wives, and they've got so many cattle it's overgrazed, so what we will do, we'll buy their cattle. And they bought them and slaughtered them and then stuck the strips of meat on a barbed wire fence and dried it. They had dried biltong. Now this was just the stuff for grinding up and putting in chicken rations, and then it would be turned into pig meat along with haricot beans and pollard. So I used to go up and buy the see how the product was made. It was very cunning what we did chemically. Here we had this rather foul blood meal made on corrugated iron. But all the abattoir byproducts being turned into something which had a world market value. We could take it down, mix it into a balanced ration, turn it into the finest ham, which was then exported or eaten.
Well, it was lucky, wasn't it, that in the light of what's happened to animal feed now, that there was never any sort of infection or anything terrible happened.
No, BSE and things. But no, we were. I used to have an argument with one of my so-called uncles, who was a very senior medical man. Said, you people are using antibiotics and antioxidants freely. And I used to use tons of antibiotics, which perhaps now is wrong. But I used to say to him, well, you wouldn't have cheap antibiotic for medical purposes, and nothing is absolutely right and nothing is absolutely wrong. What we were doing in Kenya was to get an industry going, and we can now, with retrospect and hindsight, say, well, maybe we shouldn't have done this. But in fact, it saved a lot of people from going very, very hungry, and it solved other problems en route. Kenya was, in fact, the first country outside UK and USA to use antibiotics and antibiotics in animal feeds. We were very advanced, and I think we were sophisticated. One of the things we did, for example, if you flew over Kenya, you would find around the lakes Naivasha, for example, a lovely verdant emerald green patches of lucerne. We got 10 crops of lucerne meal per annum. Alfalfa, Medijago sativa, it's a great source of vitamin A. Now, we got the vitamin A into the meat, into the poultry feed, via this wonderful crop grown by a family called Hopcroft, who were very, very pro-African, delightful people. They had the scientific knowledge to be able to run this business so that the drying was done just at the right temperature, and we paid on the beta-carotene content of what we were buying. In the same way, we bought in synthetic riboflavin, which is one of the vitamins which is deficient in the normal African diet. We got synthetic riboflavin, popped that in the poultry rations, and by that means the local population suddenly got an augmented ration. Now, back to something even more basic that Unga were doing. We knew that the bottom of the Rift Valley was copper and cobalt deficient. for East African conditions, you have to feed very much more copper and cobalt to get very good results in growth and so forth. But you couldn't grow wheat or anything. Lord Delamere discovered this privately. You couldn't grow crops or keep livestock in large numbers. The whole thing was limitation of copper and cobalt. How to get it there? How do you spread it? From an aeroplane, little dust, it'll blow away, goodness knows how to get it there. We discovered means of doing this, at least I did. Put two things together. The pyrethrum industry had a residual byproduct called mark, which was branny. It smelled lovely. It had had spirit extracted, alcohol residues, from the flowers grown high up in the mountains. And this stuff, everybody knew, insecticide, oh, that's terribly poisonous, you mustn't let cattle anywhere near it. They had mountains of this stuff. In fact, we were paid to take it away and get rid of it on our gardens. It was a wonderful fertilizer because it destroyed all the insects, and I grew sunflowers with 2-foot wide heads, never been grown there before. They were disease free. I used this stuff with the molasses from the Ugandan sugar mills. The Madhvani family, Indians, they were using molasses to tar the roads with. And so we said, well, you shove that in an oil tanker, take it down to our mill, we will pump it out with steam, we will mix it with the bran from, or the mark as it was called, from pyrethrum and a few other things. We'd also put in a lot of salt, copper and cobalt. We called these ranch cubes. And the ranch cubes were fed to the cattle in the bottom of the Maasai land. And in this way, the cobalt and copper went through the animals, out their back end, onto the ground, and areas where it had not been possible, around Stretfield's farm, for example, not been possible to keep livestock, suddenly the capacity went up. And it might have done in Lake Baringo, where we were getting the fish meal and the crocodile meal and the blood meal I was telling you about earlier. But this is the game we were in, was to manufacture out of nothing something of worth.
It sounds like it must have been very satisfying to solve these problems and try and work it out, how you were going to do this.
Yeah, one gets more pleasure in retrospect, I think.
Okay, shall we move on now?
Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit around, a little bit more perhaps about independence before we leave Kenya?
Independence in Kenya. Well, I left in 57, and I left because I wanted to progress my own career. My uncle had died, and it was quite clear that independence was going to come to Nyasaland, as indeed it did, and independence was going to come to Kenya. But it was a long way in the offing, but I could see that there might well be a bloodbath in the offing. I had access to people up in the White Highlands. I had one curious little experience. I celebrated with a man who had just become an MP in London. He was the nephew of Sir Thomas Armstrong, the MP for South Armagh, unionist. He had been elected unopposed. It's the last time this happened. He was on his farm in the Kinnancop in the White Highlands. A very liberal man, a Cambridge-educated man. He'd been Deputy General Manager of the Burma Oil Company, and that is working very closely with my father-in-law. And he went to the telephone, which just worked up there, and we were having dinner. My wife and I were having dinner with him, and he brought a bottle of champagne and said, we'd no idea what was happening. He said, I've just learned that I'm an MP, returned unopposed, and we'll have a bottle of champagne now. And he said, I'm going to go to London forthwith and take my seat. But it's an odd sort of thing that happened, and one heard rumours what was going on, but there was Shirley, who was the member of Legislative Council elected for Native Affairs, When I was at Cambridge, I'd been with a girl called Gore Brown, and her father had had the same job in the Rhodesias. Now, these people were privately saying that independence was inevitable and it was coming and how it was going to have to be prepared for. I was talking about mysterious ingredients, and there was a man called Geranium Roberts who lived in the Kikuyu Reserve, and he had the idea that he would get a corner in geranium oil, so he grew many acres of the aromatic geranium, which he distilled in steam, and then he was left with a gooey mess of green silage, which he thought would make a good animal feed. And he wanted my opinion on this. Well, I said, well, the simple thing is to let some cows eat it. And so we let some dairy cows eat it. I don't know if you've ever drunk milk which tastes of geranium oil. It's quite impossible. And we had a non-success with that. Also going to tell you about, as you go down in the Rift Valley past Stretfields, you'll find Mount Longanot. It's a little volcano, typical size. And it was used in one of the major films about Africa, and one of the Hollywood stars stands on the edge of the road, so you can't actually see that there's a major Cape to Cairo highway going behind you. And he points at Mount Longanot and says, "Gorilla country." Now, there isn't a gorilla for almost 1,000 miles in any direction, but this was used for the scene, and Kenya at that time was being used as a haunt of various famous people who would flutter through. It's said that if you sat on the steps of the New Stanley Hotel, everybody you had never wanted to meet again would pass by. But opposite the New Stanley Hotel was Torr's Hotel, and that belonged to the uncle, or great-uncle, of a man who'd been head boy of my prep school. Now, and he also went up to Cambridge, my college, as his father had been at my college. His name was Grogan, an Irishman. And Colonel Grogan had been the youngest colonel with people like Baden-Powell in the Boer War, and he'd asked a young lady in South Africa whether she would marry him. She said, "Well, what have you done, Colonel Grogan?" And he said, "Well, I'm the youngest colonel in the British Army." And she said, "So, and what are you going to do?" And he said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, what would you suggest I do?" She said, "I suggest you walk from Cape to Cairo." Well, he got as far as Nairobi, half of which he bought for 1 farthing an acre, and he started this lovely little hotel where you could get for 5 shillings a terrific steak and onion luncheon or dinner. My brother, who by that time was doing his national service, he was a pilot, and he'd been grounded because he was my height, a little higher than I am. He's 6'4", I think, and his legs were too long, and he was allowed to fly the Hermes aeroplane, which was a transport, as a national service pilot. It was a great concession. And he was flying from UK to Australia on some strange mission. We now know that he had the atom bomb in the luggage rack, and they took it to Woomera. On the way back, they decided that they would rather like to see a little bit more of the high life of Kenya, so the CO faked an illness halfway across the Indian Ocean. My brother landed as co-pilot and said, "We'll have to wait here a couple of weeks." And here were these national service, or they were regular Air Force people, living it up in Torr's Hotel and at my expense, and going round and looking at the wildlife, which was really half the reason for being in Kenya. I went on marvellous safaris with a man called Colin Bacon, who's my son's godfather. And he's one of the few people I know who was driving he worked for Ciskei, the Imperial Oil Group. He was driving across Tanganyika back from looking at game, and he suddenly noticed a little mountain, a little volcano, rather like Longanot, which he'd never seen before. And he looked and took bearings from various known places and went back. When he got to Nairobi, the East African geologists, they said he'd seen it not on their map, this volcano. And they said, "No, it isn't." And so they sent an aeroplane out, and they looked for this thing, and lo and behold, there was a brand new volcano. And so they called it Mount Colin Bacon. So he, yes, the nightlife in Nairobi wasn't affected at all by Mau Mau. I don't think we had. I can remember going to the first naughty story here. There was a nightclub which was owned by a man called Jasper Maskelyne, who was the masculine and Devant illusionist, the conjuring tricks. And he had a box of tricks, and he would show how he could undo padlocks in no time flat. And Jasper was in the Kenya police, and there was, in fact, an incendiary Mau Mau attack on a silk warehouse which went up in full view of his nightclub. And I can remember watching as Jasper Maskelyne had great difficulty in undoing the padlock to get the fire brigade inside. But that was the night. It's indicative of what went on. There's a party of people from Government House who had expressed an interest in seeing the first lady fan dancer to perform in East Africa. And in order that this should be done with discretion, all the African servants were made to remove themselves, the waiters and waitresses, and then we got the fan dancer came on. Unfortunately, I was sitting on the floor rather near the front, and people used to say I was the only man to have been struck in the face by the fan dancer's fan. But that's the evening. The Donovan Mall was the local theatre company, and my wife's little group of friends, Pam Foer, used to act for them, and it was quite amusing the extent to which the connections with a secret service would be announced, because when we had an engagement party, it was announced that Miss Foer, who works for the Secret Service, is also appearing in the Donovan Mall play. There was no secret about who the people were who were getting intelligence in those days, and we knew.
So from what you're saying, it was a very a fairly small, select society in a way. Everybody knew everybody else. People knew who they were, knew what they were doing. Would you say that?
Yes, it was. Rightly or wrongly, people knew and trusted each other. It wasn't a sort of funny handshake Masonic. There was a funny handshake Masonic group, but I didn't belong to that. In fact, I think I was doing what I was doing because I didn't. There were other people who had regimental associations. I suppose I was lucky in that I had the entree into the people who were taking decisions and who had held big jobs.
But it wasn't so different to London.
No.
It was, all the government things going on, and despite the Mau Mau problem, that was sort of incidental in a way to the life. Well, that's what it sounds like.
Yes, I can remember the night of my first son's birth. We lived in a little house, and of course we had a security guard, and we had netting and so forth, and I had a revolver. And there was rifle fire outside as I was in a hurry to get to the Mai Carberry Hospital. Rifle fire within...
Right, just something that you wanted to say, particularly about independence, about... I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the person.
Sir Richard Turnbull.
Richard Turnbull. Could you just...
Yes, well, he was the governor of Tanganyika, and he was a Scot of great perspicacity, and he brought the idea of independence to the Tanganyikan indigenous people far better, I think, than was done in either Uganda or Kenya. And I should say that UNGA Limited and the KFA were an East African organisation. I started off East African Famine Relief, but we had mills in Entebbe, for example. In Entebbe, you may remember at the airport when there was this famous hostage-taking incident. Right beside that was the huge silo in which the stocks of wheat were kept. And that down in Tanganyika, there were strategic stocks. There were mills. I had a mill in a place called Aringa. There was another one in Arusha underneath the steps of Kilimanjaro. marvellous sight. Tea plantations a little bit up, a little bit further up there'd be coffee, and there'd be sisal down in the bottom. I don't know if you know, there used to be acres of sisal. Sisal's the name of a place in Mexico, and where they made twine for making sheaves and baler twine and things like that. The moment that somebody produces a synthetic plastic string, the whole of that industry goes out of the window. It's very sad.
That's awful, because in the plastic string you can never get rid of.
Yes. But sisal, the one thing is it's a good source of cortisone. the independence of...
Yes, we go Tanganyika.
I don't think I'm very much more useful to comment on about that, other than that the Tanganyikan scene was one, when I was there was absolutely no theft in certain parts. The Germans had chopped off anybody's finger if they were light-fingered, and if you rely on your fingers to eat and work, about the third time you steal something with this vicious punishment initially. And the question is it right or is it wrong to teach people that stealing is wrong? And then you have a theft-free place.
Well, it's not right to chop off their finger.
No, it isn't. Well, it maybe saves an awful lot of things. But that was an attitude of respect which was inculcated into them before and during the First World War, which was, I think, contributory to the difference between the two countries at independence. I managed to go to find out where Livingstone and Stanley had landed at the edge of the ocean, managed to get to Zanzibar. And in Canada, one of my assistants was a man who had been dairying officer in Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar after independence. And there truly was the most dreadful bloodbath. But when I went there, we could have sailed over in a dhow. I don't think we did. But we stayed in Zanzibar, picking jewels out of the collection of the Sultan's jeweler. It was an amazing feudal medieval market in the days I was there. Now the whole place has been changed, and the Arab population was virtually wiped out, I'm told. My dairying officer friend said that he had never seen such carnage in his life. He was very scarred by it.
But you were saying that Tanganyika was better prepared for it, the people were better prepared for independence. It just was smoother.
I think generally it was smoother. On the other hand, there was not the bloodbath in Kenya, but there was very much more corruption and transfer of great wealth into a few people's pockets. There's no doubt that Kenyatta's family are now ultra wealthy, whereas many of the settlers who contributed towards his initial success are in straitened circumstances. I don't know what's happened to people like Mickey Ibu, for example. He was at Cambridge with me, same college. He was the son of Sir Ibu Purbai, who was a shell agent who had the garage at the far end of Delamere Avenue in Nairobi. Now, I can recall my steward, head houseboy, coming to me and saying, when Mickey came to a meal in about 1953, saying, there is another Hindi at the door. Now, this was a knight's son who's a graduate of Cambridge University. Little point about wheat and the effect on the tropics. Lord Delamere employed his own wheat breeder long before the war, who developed a wheat called Equator. Equator was rust resistant. Up to then, all the wheats they'd brought out had gone down with disease. It wasn't possible to have wheat there. When I arrived in Kenya, Kenya was a net exporter of wheat. Equator was marvellous. When I got to Canada, my wheat genetics friends told me that Equator's genes are in practically every loaf of bread eaten throughout the world because it is a rust-resistant gene found by Dr. Jeremy Thorpe, paid for privately by Lord Delamere, developed in Kenya, and all that has come out of Africa has not necessarily been bad or hasn't been a one-way process. That's the note I'd end on.
We're going to talk now about Sierra Leone, where you went in 1960?
Yes,
right?
Correct. In 1960, from April the 1st until April the 1st the next year, I was a member of an efficiency survey of the Sierra Leone government, which was a management consultancy exercise in the preparation of a former colony and protectorate for independence. I'd been called by Martin Bates, who was our managing director. He was also principal of the Administrative Staff College at Henley. He said, would you be prepared to go for a year for us because you have colonial experience? And I said yes, and within a week I was on an aeroplane, let my house, and the family were to follow. And we arrived in Dakar. My colleague, who was later on a director of Robinson's of Bristol, we arrived at Dakar to find that our booking onto Freetown had been commandeered by de Gaulle because he had summons to Paris all his presidents in his former colonies and given them a royal ticking off and sent them packing back. And we were left on Dakar airport with a group of assassins covered in hand grenades. We arrived in Freetown a day late, almost by UTA, not to be met, saying we had no travel documents, but merely to ring Government House. We weren't really believed at the airport, but somebody did send a launch for us and met us. And the next day, the governor, Maurice Baring, called a cabinet meeting and said, we are here for the first time in the colony and protectorate's history to greet Messrs. Belbin and Preston, who are going to conduct a survey of every ministry. It's the first time that every permanent secretary and every minister and the governor and the deputy governor have been present. There are to be no secrets from them. They are exempt from the Official Secrets Act. Our mission was to reduce government expenditure by 10%, which was about £1 million a year in those days. Sierra Leone was rich in diamonds, it was rich in ores, it was rich in agriculture in some ways. It had a university. I was assigned, because I'm in agriculture and forestry, I was also assigned customs and excise, the rice mills, which I knew a bit about. I was also assigned the job of the Provincial Commissioner's Office and the organisation of various other departments, including prisons. I was assigned I was a young man of 30s, I was assigned a vast motor car, a Humber Imperial with a glass panel and a driver and a flagstaff. I used to get in and out of this in a bit of an embarrassed condition, with a man who'd been a group captain assigned to me as for the initial months to help, a group captain Ben Bolt, of one time flying instructor at Cranwell. And he was very polite to me. He said, "After you, Pilot Officer Preston," as he opened the door, and people used to wonder what I was going to do. But we did have quite an effect. I saved the £1 million per annum by exposing a rather silly exercise which relates to the lack of communication between highly paid and well decorated with CBEs, etc., heads of departments who couldn't really see the wood for the trees. Diamonds had been found, and every farmer knew that if he was to guggle for salmon or trout or diamonds in any stream, he might just pick up a little bit of glass-like substance which would be worth a fortune. He would sell it to a Lebanese, who would sell it to somebody else, who would sell it to somebody else, who would sell it to somebody else, everybody making 1,000% en route. And it would be a vast fortune. And so all the farmers decided that they would no longer dig rice. What they would do is to look for diamonds. And Sierra Leone was in the plight of not having enough rice. So the board, the Department of Commerce, decided they would import rice and they would sell it internally, and they had their own government rice mills.
Why did they, can I stop you there, why did they decide that? Why didn't they try and work out a way for the people to grow the rice themselves? How did they make that decision?
It would have been forced labour to make them do it. They did bring in, the Chinese came in next door. There's a communist regime in Dakar, and they, I think it's Dakar, it's the next door state, there were communists, and they brought in the Chinese to show them how to grow rice, and everybody looked at the Chinese who were growing wonderful rice. They had the most energetic procedures, and they looked, isn't that marvellous, but they didn't copy them. There was a West African Rice Research Institute, which I have great admiration for, and they were improving varieties, but there was nothing they could do on a large scale to get people to grow rice. It was enough that the government could do to convince people that by parboiling rice and leaving the husk on, you got some of the vitamins and some of the proteins which were essential to human life left on the thing. Everybody wanted to have highly polished Burmese rice. So they bought rice in vast quantities. The system of buying was this, that they knew how much they needed, very roughly. They knew how much they were growing, and they wanted to increase it. So they paid a price above the price of the world market based in Rangoon to the farmers to encourage them to do it. And then, because they based the price on Rangoon price and the local purchasing price, and they made a midpoint, they had to sell 1 pound of local rice or 1,000 tons of local rice. Get the price right, they had to have the same quantity. So they kept on importing relating to the amount that they'd bought, not the amount that they'd needed. And they had, by the time I got there, on the books, they seemed to have thousands of tons in excess of what they could possibly need. And so I said, where is it? We looked for it, and it had been put in a disused dry dock for corvettes, piled bag upon bag upon bag. And one of my jobs was to actually physically count how much they had, because the insects and rats had been eating this stuff, and other two-legged thieves had been in there, and the amount that they thought they had, the amount of local rice that had been resold was an enormous problem. However, that solved the government's deficit problem. But the problem was one of preparing people for independence. They had a little narrow gauge railway, not very good. They had diamonds, which they were trying to prevent being illicitly exported. They wanted to take tax off the diamonds. They had ore mines, the Marampa ore mine up country, 18% pure iron in it. I went up to that place to look at the organisation of provincial commissions. I had a wonderful dinner and evening with a provincial commissioner. I stayed in his guest house, which had a zinc roof. For some reason my driver wouldn't stay with me on that knoll of a hill. In the middle of the night I discovered why. There was an almighty thunderstorm. There was a great crash. The zinc went off the roof, and we'd been struck by lightning. However, my evening's entertainment had been so lavish that I didn't mind a bit. I just sort of snuggled up underneath the mosquito net and waited till next day. But I wrote in the visitors' book, I was not going to pay for the electricity bill. It had struck the electricity bill and run me up £1 million in dues for the fuel consumed, which I denied. And also convinced me that there was iron ore on the official side of the valley. The iron ore was on the other side, and I said, there's another iron ore mine here. I went up there again later, and I discovered that the Prime Minister, Sir Milton Margai, charming old man, medical officer, RAMC, First War, MBE, he was the doyen, the elderly statesman, longest serving Prime Minister in all the Commonwealth. Next time he was there, he said, I've read Preston's comments, the same thing happened to me here. And he put the date, and they looked for a mine. They had even more iron ore. Now they say Sierra Leone is a very poor place, so it is. I think the problem is that easy money through diamonds has been diverted to dishonest purposes, and it's sad that that happened. It used to be that Sierra Leone was the white man's grave. I was taken to see the graveyard as a sort of ritual on arrival. Nobody lived to take their pension for a long, long while. If you were posted to Sierra Leone, you died before you gained your pension.
And you died of diseases?
Of diseases, lots of...
Why so much there? Why so much?
Well, I suppose fundamentally it's that the doctors didn't know. The doctors, as they took their fees, muttered, there is no cure for this disease.
Any more unhealthy than other places?
It was hot and damp, and Hill Station Club, the opposite of the Nairobi Club, had 600 inches of rain a year. Vast deluges, continual shower baths. It was on stilts at the top of a tiny little railway where the officials lived. The higher you could get above sea level, up the mountain, into the hill, the better your health, the cooler it was at night. And people got on in order of seniority to trundle down the hill to the Secretariat in traditional days before I was there. This is the place that Graham Greene wrote his novels in, the Hill Station Club. It was a sort of dingy hut, in my view, by comparison with the luxury of the Nairobi Club.
Well, can you just tell me quickly about the graveyard, what it was like?
A large number of stones saying arrived here 6 months, died of the yellow fever, arrived here 7 months, died of the black water fever, died of the undulant fever or the tertiary, whatever it was. They gave a sort of diagnosis, or snake bites, or whatever it was. As I told you earlier on, later on in my career, I got river blindness, which is one of the diseases which is endemic there. I was very lucky to be cured, but I'll come to that maybe later on in Nigeria. The health of people was clearly very poor. You saw a lot of people in the streets with elephantiasis of the limbs, swollen limbs, or quite obvious dementia, and you saw loads and loads of people with malaria. Every wife there ran a clinic for people. My wife, we lived in a compound called King Tom. It was right down on the coast. I had the house belonging to the Commissioner of Income Tax, and one of our neighbours was the Deputy Governor, and another was Dr. Davidson Nicol, who was the wife of the Vice-Chancellor of the university there, charming man. She had 2 children. I met her again when I was in Tobago. She was my GP in Tobago, her home country. The problems were extreme for the medical profession there. I did a survey for the efficiency surveys, how many doctors they needed and how much they could get. The provincial doctor I saw said, I see 6 patients at a time. I looked to see which one of them is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and some hope of a cure. The others get castor oil, malaria tablets, aspirin, the standard remedies, because there's no more I can do for them. They're better off here than with the witch doctor. The one who's bright, I may be able to do something for, and so I can do something for him. Now, this all came back to the naughty problem of money, and how I happened to have the Commissioner of Income Tax's house, and I was looking at revenue, and most of the revenue in Sierra Leone at that time came from three sources: diamonds and the mines. Income tax produced next to nothing. There were import duties, largely paid by the expatriate government employees, and that was it. Tom McClellan, who was the Commissioner of Income Tax, he happened to have been my collector in my private capacity in the United Kingdom. He thought this was rather funny. I was assigned his house because, having waited to greet me, he said goodbye, and I've told my deputies to tell you exactly what goes on in the department. And I discovered what went on in the department. They collected income tax from thump people, and it cost, on average, per person processed £5. The average amount collected was £5. So a lot of people, it wasn't really contributing. And when I told Sir Milton Margai that I had discovered this very intriguing fact, he said, well, that is not going to be considered a saving. He said, I have less than 5% of the population who are paying income tax. And for political reasons, that's the very minimum. I must have the people believe, at least, that they're contributing to government. The fact that they're making jobs for civil service in the income tax department is neither here nor there. They must believe that the people want this. And I decided from then on, Milton Margai was a very wise man. I had this huge car, as I told you, and the attitude to independence was quite interesting. One of my colleagues, he'd been at my college in Cambridge, he was a South African, had terrible difficulties getting up there because they didn't like South Africans, but he was a very clever mathematician. He was doing a job in the docks to see how the dock workers worked. And these men humped bags on and off boats, and they were hired by the day. And one Saturday, there was a riot. This is one of the few times I've appeared on the front page of the Daily Telegraph as a column, just one column. A riot in Sierra Leone, quelled by a white man. I had been opposite the Secretariat talking to the government printer about his printing works and how much it was going to cost after independence. And he noticed a row going on in the square. "We do not want black man government," was the chant which went up. And in came loads and loads of very tough-looking stevedore chaps who were marching, demanding an interview with the Prime Minister. So all the steel gates locked, and barbed wire, and the sentries walked inside with loaded rifles and much clicking of bolts. And the printer said there's going to be trouble. The last time this happened, a British inspector had gone out to try to quell it. The only thing they found was his hat afterwards, so it got a bit vicious. He said to me, "Do you know, Tom, you might just do something here." He rang. I said, "I'm ringing the Secretariat." He said, "If you go out, they want a white man government. If you go out," he said, "what I will tell my guards on the other side is that if you run in a circle, they'll always run in the way you're not going to circle. So you go round in a great moon. You don't go straight towards where you want to get." So there was a much conversation. Eventually, he pushed me out through the door. I was shaking at the knees. He said, final words, it's sort of, the great thing is to laugh, jump about and dance with them, grip them by the hand and laugh. And he said, if the worst comes to the worst, take your clothes off and dance. I didn't have to do that. I wandered out, shook them all by the hands, grinned, and wandered through the crowd as though there was nothing wrong, got to the Secretariat, and Milton Margai came down the steps and said, that was a fairly brave thing you did there. Thank you. He addressed them. The whole situation was defused. And that was my little moment of glory, I suppose. Rice mills we sorted out in the end. All sorts of strange coincidences went on. Don Tyndall, Professor Don Tyndall, now the National College of Agricultural Engineering, he was a horticulturalist there. And he had a superb botanic garden. I'm very given to one of the legacies, I suppose, which have come, is that botanic gardens were created a long time ago in beautiful little sites. And only thing people need to do to preserve their heritage is to perpetuate them. But I'll come later on to the palmetums and the botanic gardens in the Caribbean, which are sadly not being looked after as they might have done. I might digress a little bit into domestic life, because there was an awful lot of theft and curious domestic unruliness in Freetown. I inherited Sam McClellan's head boy, and Sam said he would pay him in his leave and I could pay him anything else. Well, sadly, the man decided that he would engage himself as a second wife, and he lived a rather wild, drunken life, not working for me, and I told him that, well, he wasn't going to work for me anymore, that I would give him the money that Sam had left for him. When Sam got back, his chap complained bitterly about my treatment of him, and he got hold of Sam by the arm and bit his arm, and then went to the head of the Department of Labour and complained that the Commissioner of Income Tax had bitten him on the arm, the evidence being quite clear, a couple of fang marks on his master's arm. I don't know how much anybody would give to bite the Commissioner of Income Tax personally. But I had a superb head boy in his place who looked after my wife and family very well when I wasn't at home. He was exactly like J. Arthur Rank's Man Who Beats the Gong, a splendid golden ripple muscle. And one day, my wife used to go out and do the medical rounds. We had 40 people in the compound, absolutely dependent upon my bringing in the bread and being healthy. And I did, in fact, have a very serious spinal injury in a wave. I broke a vertebra and had to be on my back for about a week. I counted them and I thought, gosh, the garden boy and the Ayers girls and so forth. Anyway, the head boy refused to explain to my wife what was wrong with him. And so I said, why are you not telling my wife about this? He said, I go done lose my manhood, sir. I said, what? You better show me. And what he showed me, it was a sort of rugger ball size, and it was a scrotal hernia. So I said, well, Bangora, you will have to see a doctor about this, and I will pay for it. Don't worry. By this time he had a squeaky voice, so the local army doctor I consulted about this, he said, oh yes, I know there's an absolutely splendid lady specialist, that'll teach him a lesson. So he came, and I said, he's lost his voice, it's gone squeaky. He said, that's psychological. He said, let's prove it. And so we arranged for a medical for this chap, Bangora. And the captain said, would you please drop your trousers and look at that? And, I have gone on my man who did his squeaky voice. And I had been arranged that I would say, Bangora! And he said, yes, sir. Immediately he was surprised. His voice went from the high pitch to the low pitch. And then he was told by the West African Frontier Force doctor, medical, there's nothing wrong with you. don't worry, we've got this nice lady doctor who will stitch you up. And when he left, he had a free operation on me. But that's the way things worked. In West Africa, again, I found that paying for medical and other attentions after you'd left was a very good policy.
What's this thing you've got written down here about tuna fleet lobsters?
Oh, yes. Well, we lived in King Tom, and my house looked out over the tuna industry. It was a series of trawlers which went out, and tourists would actually pay to go out with an unbarbed hook and hook tuna up, and they threw them over their shoulders into the hold of a boat. Well, occasionally they hook a lobster, or they would hook some other delicacy. And these, you could get a crate of lobsters for 10 shillings. You could get a litre of Remy Martin for 10 shillings. You could get a case of a dozen House of Lords cigars for 10 shillings. It was an amazing 10-shilling economy in those days. But you could get the lobsters, and we had the most marvellous lobster meals as the result of the debris. But I once had, I'm telling you that crime was rife, and I once had a break-in, and the method was to blow some drug through a hollowed-out bamboo pole into the nostrils of the snoring occupant behind the grill on the windows, and this happened to me. But I woke up in the middle of it. They had removed a steel door out of the kitchen. They'd been into the fridge where they had found I put the whiskey in the fridge and locked it because Bangor and his people weren't entirely reliable. And I used to lock the spirits inside the fridge at night. Anyway, they'd got into that, and they'd taken my briefcase. Now, I'd just been doing a survey of the prisons, and I had decided that it was unethical to provide any help for a prison installation, brand new, which I had been shown on the plans, which was intended for the political opposition the moment independence arose. I just said I won't want to know anything about it. I don't want to do anything about it. I'll do with the rest of the prisons. And when I was there, I suppose I may be one of the last people to have been in a prison where people were executed for cannibalism. It was a very sad case, and I hold very strong views on capital punishment, solely on the grounds of the effect it has on the people who are actually obliged to carry it out, the doctor, the clergyman, prison governor. That they had this group of people who had decided it was traditional to eat a small boy and had confessed to doing so rather foolishly, and they were 7 of them faced with capital punishment. The prison there, I'm talking about 1960-61, became pretty emotional, and the man who was in charge, the director, didn't want to be present. And so his deputy, who needed money, was a delightful Orcadian. He'd been a prisoner of the Japanese inside his own prison in Changi for the war. Healthy, strong, charming man. I knew him quite well socially, and told me a lot about the prison services and what had to be done at independence, because we had to help the government choose who was going to be the next director of prisons when the white men had left. I may say it's about the most unpopular job that anybody wouldn't want to have. However, Davidson, he had to deal with this problem. There were several other murder cases he was to do with. He got a bottle of brandy for getting up early and making sure that the law took its final and appalling course. But I am wholly opposed to it, as he was. There isn't very much you can do if it's your job. It's a sad note to end on.
Just going back to that, it does sound a very interesting case. I mean, was cannibalism not unusual then?
Well, I'm quite certain it's not unusual at all, no. The silly, almost grotesquely macabre part of the story is, one of the participants had been in the West, a lance corporal in the army, and he was under the impression that you got a first chance at every offence. And he had pleaded that this was his first offence. He hadn't actually liked the taste. I don't know whether he said this, but it was not unknown. I mean, one was dealing with fairly primitive people, because Sierra Leone was where the freed slaves went into the protectorate. Outside that, there were two tribes, the Temne and the Mende, and up country there was very, very little.
So it may have been a tribal custom, something like that?
I haven't the foggiest idea, other than that it was against the rules, and if you did it, you went into what they called King George's Hoteli, which was the prison.
And was it normally children who were killed, who were cannibalised?
I've no idea. No, I can't go into cannibalism. I can go into other grotesque areas of government deficiency. As you may know, the River Niger arises in the mountains of Sierra Leone, not very far, 100 miles or so from the sea, but it goes way up into the Sahara to Timbuktu and swings round through the desert, and then winds up in Nigeria, coming out in the Bight of Benin, a vast great river, but it's one of the curious things on the map. My father worked at the NPL in London, and the director there was Sir Henry Tizard. He was an expert on radio navigation, fixing places, and the top left-hand corner of Sierra Leone is the first place in the world to be fixed by radio navigation against the known positions of transmitters in Greenwich and Rome. So it's sort of pointed there. When he got to Freetown, long before the war, he said to the director of surveys, I wonder, could you show me where the Niger rises? He picked up a red pencil off his table and marked on a map, which happened to be handy. He just signed it as being the proof of the copy going back to the Directorate of Ordnance Surveys, and the printing would compense. He put a red line to show where the thing is. Well, when it got back to the place where they print the maps, they said, oh, this is a printer's error. This is a first-class highway with fences. A red line means that, so we've got to change this river to this. And for about 30 years, there was a printer's error which kept recurring. I have copies of it, where they showed a very good road where, in fact, there's no such thing.
Okay, so the next job you had was in Canada in 1963 was this for 10 years?
20.
20 years you were there, yeah. Can you just tell us briefly, in relation to our subject, what you were doing?
Well, I went there because my particular interest is the labour work input into agricultural systems. You can have a man sitting on a vastly automated combine harvester, or you can have hand tea plucking of tea, labour intensive. And I eventually became a director of the Association of Faculties of Agriculture in Canada, which was the representative of each of the 8 universities there which teach agriculture. I also was editor of a very minor part of the Commonwealth Agricultural Bureau, which was, and still is, the institute is now privately organised and financed, but it was the way in which all agricultural research throughout the British Commonwealth produced its journals. The Commonwealth Dairying, Beef, Grassland, Wheat, Rural Work Science was mine. And the Secretary General of this was a man, when I first got in touch with him, was Sir Thomas Scrivener. Now, Sir Thomas Scrivener had in fact been a colonial civil servant in the Federation of the Rhodesias. I can remember being taken by him. He thought he was going to get a Canadian, and he found me, and he found that my uncle had been his minister at one time, and he was much amused by this. But he took me to the headquarters in Farnham Royal, in Buckinghamshire, and we talked about how Canada's contribution could go. His successor, Mr. Jones, a Distinguished Flying Cross, he rang me up in Canada and said, could I help him? The Canadian cabinet had decided to renege on its quinquennial agreement, that is 5 years contribution of £1 million a year. They had just said, well, in cost-cutting exercise, we're not going to give this curious Commonwealth body any money. He said, we're broke. I said, well, leave it to me. And I magicked out of thin air, because I went to the Faculties of Agriculture Association meeting the next day. I said, this is disgraceful. We all rely on these journals being subsidized by an international community. Canada's a major donor, but it is the only English language précide abstract of scientific papers on agriculture in the world. This is tragic that it's going to go bankrupt. So we orchestrated a complaint from every vice-chancellor and every dean. They wrote to the cabinet. Just by chance, it was Pierre Elliott Trudeau who had been the Prime Minister who took this decision. He was put out of office. He was replaced by a man called Robert Clark, who happened just to be a professor who had an office underneath mine at the University of Alberta. And uniquely in history, a cabinet decision was reversed. And that is how the Commonwealth Agricultural Bureau comes still to be in business. It was a funny little coincidence. Now, shortly after that, I was asked by the Canadian government, would I go to help Canadian International Development Agency, CIDA, to help in Nigeria in the rehabilitation of the University of Nigeria. And I said yes, I knew a little bit about Africa and West Africa. And on my way there, I went to the Institute of Tropical Medicine. I did a course with a man who'd been a doctor in Nairobi with me in what agriculturists should know about the diseases of agriculture. As I'll come to later, I caught river blindness there a couple of years later. A very lucky encounter, that. I also went to Cambridge, where my son was at school, with the son of the Chancellor, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Nigeria, Eni Njoko. He had been the man who had engineered the peace between the Nigerian government and the Biafrans who were in rebellion. And I was going to the campus of the University of Nigeria, which had been the Biafran, University of Biafra.
Did we mention it was just after the Biafran War?
Oh, the Biafran War was just finished. I didn't say when this was. And it only just over.
What year?
We're talking about 1972.
Fine.
There were, at the University of Nigeria, half a dozen Canadians, and perhaps the same again of their spouses and children. There were Dutch, there were English, there were French contingent, there were Russians, and it was a multinational group of people. However, I had come armed with this letter from my old schoolmaster to the Vice-Chancellor about his and my son, who were at the same school. And when I eventually got to see the Vice-Chancellor, his name was Codolini. He was an Oxford-educated ophthalmologist who, instead of going back to Nigeria after qualification long before the war, had spent a whole career in Britain as an assistant registrar in some hospital in the North Country. He was politically untainted with recent Nigerian politics. When I told him that I had a letter for his predecessor, he said, "I forbid you to see him." And I said, "Vice-Chancellor, nobody forbids me from seeing anybody I want to see. Why? I'm not going to tell you." He then had heard, it had taken 5 days before he granted me an interview for some reason, and he had heard that I had said to the people running the guest house that I wanted to have produce bought in the market, which was readily available, rather than the rather restricted diet we were on. It wasn't adequate for my nutritional requirements, as far as I could see. And so I said, "Buy this, or I will bring it in and you will cook it for me." But he said, "Why do you want to do this?" And I said, "Because I know something about nutrition. You're an agriculturalist, you don't know about nutrition." So we had a bit of a confrontation, which, in retrospect, is not a terribly good thing in a career, but is quite interesting. I'd been assigned to the Faculty of Agriculture and was appointed as coordinator of Agricultural Research, an assistant to the Dean. I had discovered that Dean Modabe had recently replaced Dean Azilo. Dean Azilo was a rather charming Canadian-educated man, and Dean Modabe had appropriated all of his predecessor's books. He wanted them back. So I attempted to engineer this replacement, and was again rather unpopular with him. I think it's fair to say that most of my period in Nigeria was one of putting up a political front in the attempts by one faction of university grandees against those they had deposed and put out. In the department I was assigned to, economics, one of the lecturers was the Minister of Agriculture, charming man, Dr. Lawrence Obibuwaka, who resigned from the government of the Eastern region, formerly Biafra, on the grounds that he felt it was morally wrong that armed robbers, if apprehended, should be tied to a bundle of car tires or the goalposts in the university stadium where there was a public execution. And Lawrence said, I don't want my Mercedes, I want my job back, as a fairly junior lecturer, and I applauded him for this standard principle. There were other people in the department who were not quite so principled. The man who greeted me after a 3-day wait to see him for an interview, he said, we do not want you white men here. You don't know a yam from a banana, and you're no use to our students. So I said to him, well, I'm very sorry to have to tell you, but I noticed that you were a student of Dr. Davidson Nicol in Sierra Leone, and I happen to be the equivalent of Permanent Secretary of Agriculture there. I do, in fact, know the difference between a yam and a banana. Just because I'm Canadian doesn't mean to say this is wrong. However, we didn't get on very well, ever, and it's a sorry story that this has to be ventilated as it is now. The university campus at Nsukka was founded on some 6 square miles of land donated by Zik. Zik was the president of Nigeria for life, and his father, many people don't know, had been a clerk in Lord Lugard's office. Zik was very wealthy, and one of the first things I was asked to do was go and make myself known on Zik's farm, which he had donated to agricultural research, if need be. He'd also made a restriction on the campus that the land would be donated on the understanding that no other bank other than his bank should have banking rights on campus, which is quite a valuable concession. I told you at the time there were armed robbers, and there were, as an international contingent, in the middle of nowhere, 40 miles from the nearest airport, and there were occasional incidents on campus. One evening, there was a very serious incident. There were 2 armed guards left overnight. One guarded the Vice-Chancellor's house, the other the bank, and a gang attacked Professor Madambi, an Indian lady, household economist, and they smashed her spectacles and she got glass in her eye. They attacked the Dutch and they fired revolvers at one of the young men. How he escaped serious injury, I don't know. But there was a great hullabaloo and everybody was up and wondering what on earth was going on. The upshot was this was about 2 or 3 in the morning. Professor Madambi was taken to the Vice-Chancellor, who was an ophthalmic surgeon's house, and was informed that His Excellency did not receive patients until 10 in the morning. She had glass in her eye. And I think that is a story which should be known about this man who features in Who's Who.
Well, were these armed robbers, was it just robbery, or were people being targeted for some reason?
Oh, it was straight. The problem, according to Obibuwaka, was that they couldn't emerge from the forest. They had to live. They had to feed their families. They needed money. The people with the money I had probably twice the income of anybody else. Don't think I was worth it, but that's what I was given. I was able to send my sons to quite expensive schools. I don't see anything wrong in accepting it, in that they are doing their bit for the world now. But I think most people would have thought, well, maybe it's wrong, he should have this amount of money, and why should these people have motor cars when we don't? And the armed robbers had no choice but this. They couldn't give themselves up. There was nowhere they could go. I might give you Billy Bassey, the bursar's emissary to me. The day I arrived in this strange place in the middle of nowhere, it's a 40-mile taxi ride from an airport, which is about 3 hours away from the capital, Lagos. The day I arrived, the son of the bursar came to me and told me that he was the son of the bursar, that he wanted to go to Canada to take an airline pilot's course, and that his father was in fact in charge of the housing committee and I wouldn't get a house assigned to me unless I subscribed. I told him, I won't tell you what I told him, but it was quite polite and it was a no. I might tell you another thing about Billy Bassey, the bursar, and the Vice-Chancellor. My wife was acting chairman of the Department of Romance Languages. She'd been in Nigeria for quite a while, teaching French at other universities. The price of the French text and all books in the university library at the former University of Biafra was exactly twice what they were in the University of Ife or the University of Ibadan. The directors of the bookstore were Billy Bassey, the bursar, and Codolini, the Vice-Chancellor. And my wife and I used to go down by car to Ife, buy books and bring back a load of books and sell them privately to students. This wasn't terribly popular. Should a student require to have an interview with the Vice-Chancellor, they could borrow a gown for £5, which was about a term's subsistence. They could borrow a gown. No student could be in the presence of the Vice-Chancellor unless in academic dress.
So all this corruption, I mean, how did you manage to cope with that every day? And did you start turning a blind eye eventually to anything?
Oh, no. I used to fulminate about it and go around saying, I'm fireproof, I'm sorry that you people can't. It was quite bizarre. I hope you're going to be able to use this tape.
Maybe. I mean, it's also like something out of Alice in Wonderland.
It is. The Tropical Agricultural Association quite recently, as I mentioned to you, the job prospects are very, very small now for a variety of reasons. Largely that there's so many people coming out of the University of Nigeria Department of Agriculture to compete with them. They don't need people trained in this country, but that our members are reluctant to work in any country where this sort of dishonesty and corruption is so appallingly obvious.
It's still going on like that now? It's bad.
I don't know. My son is out there and he tells me what he thinks going on, and a lot of people tell me it isn't as bad. But nobody is actually prepared to be open and clear about what was actually going on. And I wouldn't like you to believe that I spent my time there finding fault. I didn't. I had some utterly charming friends. The sculptor who made those sculptures there. Charming, decent man who wants nothing to do with this sort of scene. Low profile.
But it was the people who were in charge who were making money out of it somewhere along.
It was greed. We had a fire, I think a genuine fire in the Faculty of Agriculture, in which the entire office block burned. The students rescued all my books and my mark books. I think they gave Lawrence Obi Buwaka his mark books out. The man I don't like, I didn't trust. He never saw his things again. He happened to be absent from campus. And a very curious thing, when the fire occurred, 2 women appeared on the scene. I was there. A little later on, they were in charge by then. They were the wife of the head of the department, an English lady, blonde, and the wife of the Vice-Chancellor, an English lady, from Durham. And they were giving the orders on behalf of their husbands. Quite extraordinary. Quite.
Arson then?
No, it wasn't arson, but marks can be bought, you know.
Yeah.
And that is what was going on. In fact, it was known there was an honest element in the university. There was a large amount of personation in exams. People who'd passed exams would sit in the place of a chief's son and get the degree in his name for them. Very odd. Can I tell you about a strange thing? My stepdaughters were little blonde girls, 6 and 10, and they went to the university school, from which they had actually to be removed because a little bit of racism in reverse. People would yell at them, white woman, Onichwa. And they didn't mind it, but it was so persistent that we decided it was better if they were tutored by people on campus. But they drew my attention to something quite interesting. The Biafran army had improvised tanks and made a farm tractor. They'd put slabs of steel around it and made it look like a tank. And when they'd been captured, they'd been dragged up, and these were trophies of war which were parked outside the university ministry building, the size of this room, tanks. But if you looked through the slit holes, you could see human skeletons. And the remains of the drivers were there 3 years after the event in the university. Metacarpals. Yeah, nice little toy for a little girl. Very odd. Tell you about art. There was a charming Austrian refugee by way, went to the Bauhaus, George Adams, taught in London. Charming man. And everybody on campus had to have some extra duty, and George's he was in charge of garbage collection, because there was no garbage collection originally in this site. So we were all issued with garbage bins, but they were much better for storing water in. And we were told to put our household refuse in these things first day. And the truck came round and collected our garbage. Unfortunately, it tipped the garbage out and piled up the garbage tins, took them off to the market and flogged them, people for water containers. So that was the end of the story of the garbage collection. But we had a swimming pool, and there'd been an international-sized swimming pool as part of the original features donated by Zik and the American government. I think there's a little story at the University of Nigeria to be learned about unilateral aid. Zik had been to the University of Michigan, and the campus was laid out exactly the same as the University of Michigan. That is the sports stadium in the middle, with the administration and library roughly in the middle. And then the Faculty of Arts, 1.5 miles to the north-east. To the southeast, 1.5 miles, the Faculty of Engineering or something. And then the Faculty of Agriculture, 1.5 miles to the northwest. And so if you were going to do a course in arts and then one in agriculture, one in science, you had, between lectures, you had a traipse of at least 1 mile. And this is how the University of Michigan is to this day. And I've been to the University of Michigan and I've seen the original. I've timed how long it took on the university. In the tropic, it's much worse than it is in the States in terms of physical exertion. You just can't get there. You miss 10% of what you're supposed to know. And I always say rather mockingly to graduates of the University of Michigan, I'm not surprised you're 10% more ignorant than most people, because you didn't hear the lecture. You missed it. But when the universities of Nigeria's Faculty of Agriculture burned down completely, we were then moved out even further, and we actually had tractors and trailers trailing people through the town, and it was really almost impossible for students to do courses as they had been set out. It was a physical impossibility to get from one place to the other, the difficulties of books, laboratories. On my way into arriving at Enugu, a Dutch professor of mathematics' wife was on the plane and spotted me and said, "You're going to employ Basil." I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, Basil used to be the head steward for the World Health Organization's director." She was a medical doctor, and I was with him. "Basil is looking for a new master. He will only work for a bachelor. He's a magnificent houseboy. And I'll introduce you. Don't get anyone else. So what you've got to do is to pay him more than anyone else. You're a Canadian, you can do it. The other thing you've got to do is to pay off his bride price on his wife. He's in love with Grace. He's paid half the cows and he wants the rest." And so I used to say to my Canadian students, "Do meet a man before who has bought another man a wife." Because my deal with Basil was that the bride price for Grace would be paid if I left Nigeria in good health with all my possessions. He got terribly worried in the last month that some accident might befall us. But that's Basil. He had an amazing trick. He could debone a chicken, a tough old country chicken, take all the bones and guts out of it, and it would appear on the plate as though it had got bones in it, but much reduced in size. And he could do the most fabulous onion rings, but he wouldn't work for a woman. Very strange. The palmitum at Sapaba is one of the most idyllic paradise spots in Nigeria. It is a place where people put specimen trees of all sorts of palms and a little rest house adjacent to a lagoon which is filtered to have pure clean water in it. The water is filtered by a sandbank, and it is a delightful little spot. But the trees are getting old, and it was very clear that this ancient Victorian notion, they had the early ships that were trading used to come up to Sapaba, and there was terrible deaths of these early diseases of people at Sapaba, but eventually it became quite a healthy spot. By contrast with that, there was General Gowon's little resort up in the mountains in the edge of real guerrilla country, the high mountains at Obadu, where you got rolling country like Devon and Salisbury Plain with Devon cattle and creamy teas and strawberries and marvellous streams full of trout. And you could go up the mountains and find these idyllic spots, and that is where Gowon kept his horses, and we went for Christmas away from the crowd to get to these places, very much more like Kenya and Tanganyika, and it gave me the contrast between the two. In Central Africa and East Africa, you do get the large villages with vast markets, nowadays covered with an umbrella effect sheets of brightly coloured translucent plastic, selling knickknacks and bones and merchandise of all sorts. But the markets were the feature to me of West Africa, that they were a trading organisation, that farming wasn't necessarily the best thing. My interest in work science took me to get to know a number of farmers very well and to understand what I believe to be the basic problem of small-scale farming competing with plantation-scale planting. Whether they can do it or not, I don't know, but that is another matter outside this.
It's an observation.
Yes. When I got back to London from Nigeria, I felt very exhausted and very itchy, and I rang up a friend who'd been a doctor in Nairobi who was working at the Hospital for Tropical Diseases at St Pancras. I rang him up from Waterloo Station and said, asked for an instant diagnosis, and he said, "Get on the underground, come and see me in an hour's time, my car will meet you at the tube station." And he got me into his surgery. He took a snip of skin off my arm and put it under a microscope and said, "You're absolutely crawling, as I thought. You've been in Nigeria and you've got river blindness, onchocerciasis, and it's very serious. You must come to hospital." Well, I couldn't do that immediately for various reasons. But I was very, very, very lucky because I was one of the first people to be cured of this disease. The man I shared rooms with at Cambridge, Douglas Moyer, he was invalided out of the eastern region of Nigeria with an OBE and onchocerciasis and never got better. It gives you elephantiasis, you puff up, and your lymph glands are infected with little microfilaria. It's transmitted by a bite from a fly aptly named the Simulium damnosum, and there used to be no cure. There are 20 million people were then with the disease, 2 million of whom were blind, mostly in Nigeria and a band along that sort of area, crossing over to Ethiopia. There is now a cure, and it's distributed free by Merck as an act of philanthropy. Being free, nobody can sue them for side effects.
What's Merck?
MERCK, it's the International Drugs Company. They're in Poole, in Dorset. But they use the drug for veterinary purposes. It's ivermectin, it's called. But they don't sell it for human purposes. It's known to be effective. I wasn't cured by it, but I'm very, very lucky, because if the filaria get in your eye, you have a sort of snowflake effect and you can't see. It's very sad.
So how come you got this drug? You got it from the doctor and the...
I was treated in the hospital for tropical diseases. One of the things about being in the tropics, I suppose, is the luck of the draw on medical problems. I was telling you earlier on about the doctor I was in Sierra Leone who was treating 6 people. And I came to him one morning and I just happened to be up, so I said, when I was shaving, I looked at this boil in my neck and there's a couple of eyes looking at me in it. He said, well, that's not very serious. Does your boy iron your shirts? So I said, I don't know. So he said, well, if he ironed your shirts, you wouldn't have a tumbo fly. And tumbo fly hatches, burrows in under the skin, and then looks out of a boil-like looking hole. He said, you're a scientist, you know how to get rid of this. What's your cure? The cure is actually to put some Vaseline on it. And it can't breathe, so it pops out of its hole of its own volition, whereas if you try to push it out, it tries to stay in.
How big is it?
Tumbo flies, about as long as your little fingernail. Not tiny, I mean, no, it's enough to be upset by. But if you've had a tumbo fly, you don't forget it. And the same with malaria. I mean, people have had malaria and cures for it. It's one of the things which goes with the job of being in the tropics, is the disease problem.
Let's just talk a little bit now about Trinidad and Tobago. I know this was obviously post-independence, but just a little bit of what your impressions were.
Well, my job there was for the Commonwealth Fund for Technical Cooperation, and I was supposed to be the agricultural engineer for Tobago, which is a little island, quite a small community. By chance, my great-great-grandfather was harbour master of Trinidad, and some of his family still live there, and I managed to make contact with them when I got there, which made things very pleasant, and I got to know people on the island I might not otherwise have known. But the problem there was very similar to the problem in Sierra Leone. They had oil revenues, and the oil revenues caused people not to want to pick up the coconuts in the coconut plantations, not to pick up the limes in the lime orchards that Rosie's lime juice came from. They preferred to live on the dole system. I can't remember what they called it now, but they had, I think, $79 a day or some such sum, Trinidad, for being unemployed. It came out of the oil revenue, and they were disinclined to do hard manual work. There were a lot of people who were trying to grow tomatoes, for example. Tomatoes were being imported from Florida at that time, but they could be grown because Tobago had been the market garden for Trinidad. Everything gone on a ship round into Port of Spain, central marketing. You were better off with a boat in Tobago.
You're talking about the way the garden changed. It's incredible.
Yes. Sadly, outside the agricultural office, there had once been an arboretum with very nice trees in it. And again, as with the palmetum, it had rather gone to seed, but there were some magnificent new gardens, very like the Kenyan situation, the flamboyants, the bougainvilleas and the frangipanis and the golf courses and the hotel and tourist industry had taken over from the market garden industry. But it was a fascinating place. They had not very much coming out of the coconut trees that you could see in terms of industry, but it was used as a background rather more to the tourism. It was there that I had two re-encounters. Dr. Davidson Nicol, the wife, her husband had been Vice-Chancellor of the University in Freetown, part of the University of Durham. He'd then been the number 2 in the United Nations, and she had returned to her own home base to be a general practitioner in the hospital in Tobago, and it was very funny to find her as a neighbour again after a full cycle. And the other person who came into my life there was Lady Claude Hamilton, who was a neighbour in Nakuru in Kenya. Her husband had been a big rancher, and I'd met them often at the Agricultural Society in Nairobi. And here she was doing a world tour and wound up come to see Tobago because Tobago was allegedly a place to go.
How old was she?
Oh, I think she must have been in her 80s. She was a great old dame. She was a widow and very rich, but travelled very simply and loved meeting people. I think one of the attractions was that Norman Parkinson lived there, and he lived in a wonderful house up in the mountains looking over a misty sea, producing pigs in his basement. This lovely house, and at the bottom of it there was this factory for making Parky's porkers, which he sold in New York.
Presumably they'd met before.
Oh yeah, yes. He was a great chap. One of the more famous people there.
What about a few retrospective thoughts now about your career? Because we've covered quite a lot of detail about all the different places you lived in and worked in.
Well, I'm very lucky in that I now realise that I had a career which did allow me to travel and stay in places and know and get to understand the agriculture when the agriculture was fairly simple. I don't think we touched on my work in India for the CGIAR ICRISAT, which is an international organisation, the International Centre for Research into Crops for the Semi-Arid Tropics. I was there editing papers on biotechnology for tropical crop improvement. And there one was looking at, do we help the Third World, the former Commonwealth, or the current Commonwealth, former Empire, do we encourage it to go along the path of plantation agriculture or along the path of subsistence or small family farm unit production? How is it going to develop? Because it is going to be tragic to the way of life which I saw when I originally went to Africa, of largely subsistence farming, seeing them turned out and made to be city dwellers on inadequate diets with poor nutrition. And I think there's some very big questions which people should address rather more seriously than we have at the moment.
Do you feel more akin to being a member of the Commonwealth than a European now?
C'est un problème très difficile à prendre. Je suis un citoyen du monde.
Yeah.
But I think I speak English, and the English educated ethos, system of morality and justice and law and order. I find these two have been, in the main, a civilizing process, and I don't like to see them diluted with things which, to me, are not satisfactory alternatives. I don't regard plantation agriculture, for example, as being a satisfactory alternative for the type of diet which could be produced if it was properly organised and financed, and if there weren't people being overly greedy en route. But I have no mechanism. There is no cure for greed that I'm aware of.
Another question I want to ask is, what are your thoughts about the way when independence came quite fast to African countries, one after another, that the British did leave very quite soon. What do you think? It's inevitable, or?
At the time, I suppose I felt it was folly. I was the focus in several places of people saying, you're giving us independence far too soon. Secretly, when I went to Nigeria, one of the first people who met me off the plane was a man who was an ex-West African army man, sergeant, who said, nice to see you back, sir, impeccably dressed in white uniforms. We're far too corrupt here. Well, there's two ways of doing it. One is you can sort of jump off the heap and see who's going to scramble to the top first, which is not very far from what happened. Or you can prepare people, or you can pretend you hope you've prepared people. I really don't know how to rewrite history so that with retrospect it could have been done better.
I think we had the chance in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I don't know very much about Hong Kong.
No, I don't.
Yes.
Only because everyone knew when it was going to happen.
Yes. Well, most of these independence things, it's been known it was going to happen.
Perhaps not with so much more.
Yeah.
It's not with a contract.
I was talking about Milton Margai. I could never understand quite what sort of vanity made him do it, but I'm told that in the speech from the throne, in which they said, well, Messrs. Production Engineering have in fact made this report, this is how the place should be run. They had this great handover process. Sir Maurice Dorman, he became the High Commissioner or Lieutenant Governor or whatever it was, Governor General, and much hand clapping and dishing out of booze. But the main thing was a firework display in which old Milton Margai's visage momentarily appeared, courtesy of, I don't know which firework manufacturer made it, but a striking likeness in the sky. Then it's gone, sort of flash in the pan stuff. I find it quite extraordinary that people would want to do that, but it is a form of ego boost to take on the job of being the power man without any prospect of personal gain. I suppose it's extraordinary to expect anybody would want to do it.
Right, we're just ending the tape now, but I just wanted to ask you about your impressions of Elspeth Huxley, because I believe you were mentioned in a couple of her books.
Yes, I was privileged to know her in that she wrote a book uncommissioned called No Easy Way, which was about the Kenya Farmers Association, KFA, and the history of Unga, and I was asked to entertain her for lunch on a couple of occasions, I think, and she did include little bits and pieces of what I had to say. She was very intelligent, rather an applied biologist. I think she tended to regard her attitudes to colonial settlement, and having been Kenya brought up, that the intruders weren't quite the people who should be running things, that it should be the indigenous folk, such as she put in her Flame Trees of Thika, which comes over very well to me as a period of her time. I also met her mother, and she edited her mother's diaries in a thing called Letters from Nellie. But she was farming a little shamba in the country, and she had enormous amount of grazing, and I gave her a bit of a ticking off and said, look, there's enough to feed 4 cows, and you've only got 1 here. And in her diaries she said, Mr. Preston from Egerton. Now, she was related to Lord Egerton of Tatton, who'd founded that agricultural institution, being very large landowners, who I don't really approve of at all, because very few of them know what they're doing, and many of them were at Cambridge with me. Can't think. Elspeth was a very wide spectrum of interests. I think one of the things that's happening in agriculture at the moment, people are a dairy scientist, a swine scientist, a poultry scientist. You went into the University of Nigeria, there were enormous notice boards Centre for Poultry Keeping, and then there was another one, the University of Nigeria Centre for Cattle Rearing, and then the University of Nigeria Centre for Swine Research and Teaching. Little point about wheat and the effect on the tropics. Lord Delamere employed his own wheat breeder long before the war, who developed a wheat called Equator. Equator was rust resistant. Up to then, all the wheats they'd brought out had gone down with the disease. It wasn't possible to have wheat there. When I arrived in Kenya, Kenya was a net exporter of wheat. Equator was marvellous. When I got to Canada, my wheat genetics friends told me that Equator's genes are in practically every loaf of bread eaten throughout the world, because it is a rust-resistant gene found by Dr. Jeremy Thorpe, paid for privately by Lord Delamere, developed in Kenya, and all that has come out of Africa has not necessarily been bad or hasn't been a one-way process. That's the note I'd end on, I think.
We're going to finish the tape there. So that's the end of the tape today on